So the NATO alliance, the bedrock of Western security for the last 75 years, is facing what might be its biggest stress test ever. And right at the heart of it is a threat from President Donald Trump to pull the U.S. out completely. This is all happening, by the way, during a really tense conflict with Iran, which is pushing the entire alliance right to the breaking point.
I mean, that's a statement that leaves pretty much zero room for doubt, right? This stark declaration is threatening to create a historic crisis within the 75-year-old military alliance. So what's really kicking this all off right now?
Well, the spark that lit this particular fire is the war with Iran. President Trump's frustration with his European allies is just boiling over, and it all centers on what he sees as their failure to show up and participate in the conflict.
Look, from the White House's point of view, this is pretty simple. The U.S. is in a really serious conflict, and they were expecting their closest allies to join the fight. But that help just hasn't come, and it's leading to what one source called mounting frustration back in Washington. But then you have the other side of the coin, stated pretty bluntly by the British Prime Minister. European leaders are looking at this very differently. They're drawing a hard line in the sand, and they are determined not to get pulled into a conflict they just don't see as their own, no matter how much pressure comes from the United States. And look, this isn't just talk. We're seeing actual moves being made. For example, Britain has told the U.S. it can only use its air bases for purely defensive stuff. That one restriction, it just shows you how huge the gap is between the U.S. and its allies on this whole issue.
But this whole thing goes way deeper than just this one war. What we're really seeing is a fundamental clash, a huge disagreement on what NATO is even for. And it's a conflict that's been simmering under the surface for years. So this really breaks down two totally different ways of looking at the alliance. On one hand, you've got President Trump, who seems to see NATO as a paper tiger, a kind of transactional deal where America's footing the bill to defend Europe and not getting much back. But on the other hand, the European allies and, a lot of experts, they see NATO the way it was originally created, as a purely defensive alliance for everyone's security, not some blank check to jump into any war the U.S. decides to fight. And the president himself put it this way, basically questioning if the whole alliance is balanced at all. It's this feeling, this idea that America is being taken advantage of, that's really at the heart of his threat to just walk away.
Now, let's be clear. This isn't some brand new complaint. For years, President Trump has been making the argument that most NATO members aren't paying their fair share. And the numbers do back him up on this. You've got 23 nations not hitting the alliance's defense spending goals, and only 5 that are. So the key thing to get here is that all this anger over the Iran war, it's being piled right on top of these really old frustrations about money.
Okay, so all of this kind of forces us to take a step back and ask a really basic question. What was NATO even created for in the first place? If we want to understand the fight happening now, we have to look at what the treaty was originally all about.
So, at the very core of NATO, you have this one super powerful idea, collective defense. It's written right into Article 5 of the treaty, and it basically says an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. It's the ultimate "I've got your back" promise. It is the absolute bedrock of the entire alliance.
So you have to wonder, right? In its entire 75-year history, how many times has this critical all-for-one clause actually been triggered? The answer might really surprise you. It's just once.
And this is where the story takes a really ironic twist. That one and only time Article 5 was ever used, it was to defend the United States right after the September 11th attacks. NATO allies, including troops from Britain and all over Europe, came to America's side in Afghanistan.
Okay, so that brings us to the huge practical question here. With all this political chaos, can a U.S. president actually pull the country out of NATO all by himself? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. There are some pretty major hurdles in the way. First off, the U.S. Constitution, it's actually silent on how to break treaties. But then there's a law from 2023 that flat out says you need approval from Congress or the Senate to withdraw from NATO. Any move to get around that would for sure end up in a massive court battle. And on top of all that, the NATO treaty has its own rules, like a mandatory one-year notice period. And get this, there's this really weird, kind of fascinating procedural quirk. The NATO Charter says any country leaving has to give its one-year notice to the United States, because the U.S. is the official keeper of the treaty. So for the U.S. to leave, it would have to literally send a formal notice to itself. Talk about a strange loop for a very strange situation. So when you put it all together, the war, these clashing worldviews, the legal mess, it all comes down to this one critical question. With tensions this high and the disagreements this deep,
Is this incredible military alliance, maybe the most successful in history, about to face its biggest crisis ever?